Hello, good people of Goodreads, and thank you for so many great questions. I'm out talking about Beautiful Ruins, my novel, which is out in paperback, and was honored and humbled to see so many great questions. It was hard to just choose a few to answer. So if you come to my readings in any of your various hometowns, I'll do my best to answer questions there too. But I'm going to get right to them. Debbie asks, "Hi Jess, I loved all the different narrative forms you used to tell the story in Beautiful Ruins. Third-person narratives in multiple timelines, an excised first chapter of a biography, a play, a short story, a pitch, and a pass that breaks a Hollywood contract. Did you start working on the book planning to use them all, or did they gradually come to life as Beautiful Ruins took shape?" I would have to say the latter. First of all, thank you. I'm glad you liked the form. That to me was the challenge of the book, but also the thrill of it. And I sort of realized, I worked on this book for about 15 years, off and on. I'm able to work on several different things, and I kept writing myself into walls and having to start over. The first wall I wrote myself into was I had Pasquale and Dee, these two characters meeting, and I thought, what are they going to do? Who are these people? And I couldn't get past that first chapter. So one of the first things that I wrote was a chapter with Alvis Bender, a writer who comes to Porto Vergonha. And I had two problems. I was sort of stuck in the narrative, but I also needed someone to name the Hotel Adequate View, which is not a very Italian thing to do. So I needed an American, and I wanted an American writer. And it was easy to make this American writer have the problem I had, which was that he was stuck with one chapter of a book and he couldn't go past it. I'd been stuck for probably 2 or 3 years. And once I got to that point, I sort of wanted to see Alvis Bender's chapter. I wanted to see what he'd written. And this started a sort of pattern. When I would get stuck in the novel, I would go back to those different kinds of forms. Over that period of time, I was writing short stories and screenplays and poetry, all kinds of forms. And I became interested in storytelling itself as the story. And so each of those forms opened up. The hardest one, and the one that probably bedeviled me the most, was writing a movie pitch, a pitch for Donner, the story of the Donner Party. And that was a form I'd never seen. And I wanted to see if I could make the most outlandish and ridiculous movie pitch that I could and see if it worked almost as in itself as a literary form. So it was great fun. I was pleased to have a literary journal take that and publish it, which proved to me that maybe it had worked. So thank you for a great question. Rebecca says, "I love the book, thank you. Your setting descriptions of Italy were stunning and beautiful, thank you again. How did you come up with Pasquale's dream to build a tennis court? Do you have a tie or a love of Italy that made the setting personal and reminiscent for you?" I have a very close tie to Italy in that I married an Italian woman, second generation Italian, and she took me to Italy the first time in 1997, and we got to meet her family up and down the boot, and I fell in love with the culture. I fell in love with the food and the people and the way of life, and it's the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. On that trip, we wandered into the Cinque Terre, and it was the off-season. It was rainy, and so there were no tourists, and we found ourselves in a hotel called the Albergo Pasquale. I still carry a card from that hotel in my wallet because I just loved the place so much. And as a young writer, I was in my early 30s then, and this seemed to me like the kind of romantic place that should inspire a writer. And so that was sort of the original impetus for the novel, was that trip in 1997. I went back again about a decade later and re-immersed myself in Italian culture, and it was great. In the meantime, I researched in a million different ways, but that initial feeling about Italy, especially for a kid who hadn't traveled. I didn't go on an airplane until I was 20 years old. My first trip to New York was for a book tour, so I hadn't really seen the world, and to drop into that place was one of the most amazing things that's ever happened to me. You ask about Pasquale's tennis court. Throughout the writing of this book, I never thought, honestly, that I would be talking about it, that readers would come to it. It was a very personal book. So the original idea had to do with my mother getting cancer and me going to Italy around that time. Later, I would write about writer's block and trying to work in Hollywood, and I would find characters whose dreams that I sort of connected with in some way. And Pasquale was the character who I connected with the most. like him. I still live in the hometown that I came from. I felt like it was this small provincial place, and I wanted to give him a dream that seemed as unlikely as my dream of being a writer, which growing up in a place like I did, the family of a cattle ranching family and a very blue collar family, it seemed like a completely crazy dream. And the only thing that I could think of for Pasquale that was that crazy was building a tennis court in the cliffs. This unlikely shelf of a tennis court that you could see from the water. And like him, you know, he had only seen tennis in books. He didn't have any real experience with it. And that's often how I felt as a young writer. I felt as if everything I knew about writing came secondhand from a book. And so Pasquale's dream of a tennis court was the way I think I connected with him as a dreamer and as someone who felt like life might pass them by. Tony asks, Richard Burton has had a big year. Beautiful Ruins, the Lifetime movie, Liz and Dick, the release of his collected letters. What drew you to using Burton as a character, and what stage of your creative process did the idea develop? And do I have a favorite Burton work? I love Richard Burton stuff. Favorite works, The Comedians, I think, is a great film. There's an old video you can find on YouTube, and I encourage you to look it up. It's not a video, it's actually film of Burton doing Hamlet, and it's from a fixed camera in the center, and you can't take your eyes off him. It's one of the most amazing things I've seen. I wish I could see more of his stage work. That was the Burton that inspired me. And that inspiration came about, I had chosen 1962 almost at random. I had started with a character about my mother's age, had sort of wandered away from that, wanted to write about the Cinque Terre in a time when it wasn't as spoiled by tourism, so I landed on 1962. I'd been writing for a little bit for Hollywood, and I was interested in the idea of acting and actors and sort of the creative impulse that pushes them. And so I had to find out what was going on in Italy in 1962 that might involve an American actress, and that landed me squarely in Cleopatra, which was one of those researching rabbit holes that was so glorious to go down. The story just got richer and more interesting. And unlike a lot of people, I had very little interest in Liz. She seemed to me to be an interesting character, certainly, but I felt like I already knew her. The character who really drew me in was Burton. And he seemed to connect with the other characters as someone who was driven and pushed by all of these ambitions, who showed amazing promise, and who, according to the world, drank his promise away and squandered you know, this amazing acting talent. And yet there was something so compelling about him, even to the end. And you ask at what point he worked his way into the story. It was pretty early, probably around 2006, early, 9 years into the process of writing the novel. But there was a major, probably around 2007 or 2008, I wrote the scene with he and Pasquale in the car. And from that moment, I loved having him in the book. The big problem then was I didn't know if I'd get him out of the book. I was afraid he would just drink his way across 200 pages. But his charm, his intelligence, his erudition, and you mentioned the diaries. If you go to those, you'll find Richard Burton, who is who wanted to be a writer, and the diaries are so brilliantly written. And one of my favorite things to see in those diaries was a gap between 1960 and 1964, which is, of course, when Beautiful Ruins takes place. And so I like to imagine that Beautiful Ruins slides nicely into Burton's very real diary. I think, for me, though, the key moment with Burton was when I was researching in 2010, and I came across a New Yorker article that described Burton in his 50s as a beautiful ruin. And at that moment, it was almost as if I realized what he was doing in the book, that he was a sort of talisman hanging over the top of all these characters, that his ambition and promise was the reflection of all of theirs. And that they, in the same way, even though their dreams may not come true, they may not fulfill the promise of their youth, they achieve a certain dignity and beauty even in their ruined state. And that seemed to me like such a human thing. That seemed true of all the people I know, all the people I respect, that even though things may not go exactly the way we draw them out in the beginning, maybe they go better in some ways. Often, though, we find other places, other dreams to follow, and Burton seemed to signify that for me. And Kathy asks, did you follow the tournament of books, and how did you feel about the final outcome? Did you yourself read any of the other novels nominated for the tournament? I love the tournament of books. I've followed it. This is the second year that I've been aware of it. It's been going on for a while, but I'm a huge basketball fan. I play, I'm not bragging in calling myself probably the best one-eyed point guard of my size and age in this room right now. So I'm a huge basketball fan. Anything that ties in books and basketball, I will follow. I play on a literary basketball team with several other writers called the Spokane Dirty Realists. So when I saw a books tournament designed like March Madness, like a basketball tournament, I was thrilled. And I was thrilled to be in it. I was thrilled to win my first round game. I lost to Gone Girl. What can I say? That happens. I loved, I think I'd read all but 3 of the novels in the tournament, and I was fans of all of them. I thought they made amazing choices. There was one, you know, people will get on and comment, and even those were great to see. And people, there was some confusion about the ending of the book. Some people found it sentimental or corny or something, that it wrapped up all of those stories. And of course, everyone comes to a book and has their own opinion. But I did at one point want to get on there and write what I intended with the ending of the novel. Was not the sort of Hollywood wrap-up, but almost a parody of that. But using it as a way to show how each of the moments of these characters' lives, which is to me what the novel's about. People have called it a romantic novel, and I think it is romantic, but to me it's romantic in an existential way. It's about the way we fall in love with moments, the way moments can define our lives. And the moment Pasquale sees Dee is far more important than the relationship they end up having, which isn't much of a relationship at all, but it's a moment that allows him later on to make a real choice about his life. And so at the end of the novel, I had this idea that the novel is in all different tenses, past tense, present tense, first person sometimes, third person. And so I wanted, in the end, all of the stories you'd seen to have one more moment, all in the present. Because if the thing that I was proposing in this novel was that everything happens at once, that all of these moments exist forever, then I wanted each moment to sort of exist one more time. That doesn't mean that some people might not find too much sentiment in it or find it too much of a wrap-up. But for me, that ending was, it's probably the ending of, at least of my novels, it's the ending that I was the happiest with when I was done. When I finished, I did the thing that Las Vegas dealers do when they're done at the table. I just went like that. All right, Aaron asks, given what you know now and how far you've come in your writing career, if you were able to go back in time to when you started out as a writer and leave yourself a note from your future self, what would it say? That's an interesting thing to talk about in terms of this book, because I started this book as a very different writer than the writer who finished it. I was, like a lot of young writers, I think I was so concerned about the way I was perceived and whether or not I was a real writer. I felt as if, I think I felt like a fraud most of the time calling myself a writer. I would sort of mumble and look at my shoes, and I don't think I quite realized the amount of patience that it takes, the amount of resolve that it takes. And I think I lucked into lucked into situations in which I was writing the kinds of work that I wanted to write, and that's the only thing you can do. I have a great editor who encourages me to write the stories that compel me, that push me along, and I think if I had worried less about those things and just written, I think that's the note I would have sent myself. When I look back, I think I sort of did that. I probably would just tell myself, one day you'll be in New York, you'll be standing in Times Square, and on the Jumbotron over your shoulder will be the cover of Beautiful Ruins. So you can relax a little bit. But I'm not sure it would have worked. I was a writer. We don't relax very well. Terry asks, our book group read it, Beautiful Ruins, I'm supposing, and it was a big hit. Do you see your book translating onto the silver screen? Who do you see playing the leads in the movie version of your book? I hope it will translate into film. It's a little strange for me. I'm working on a screenplay version of it, and it's very early. I can't say if anything will come of it or not. But it is a little strange to have written a book that is in part a satire of Hollywood and then to actually be working on a script. I'm always on the lookout for moments that seem ludicrous and that seem like something out of the novel. But so far, it's been a great process. I never know. The writer has very little control in these situations. All I'm trying to do in writing the script is protect the essence of the story. I adapted one of my other novels, The Financial Lives of the Poets, and I've worked on adaptations of a couple of others. And so I know that the process begins with cutting about 2/3 of what was on the page. And the reason that I love writing novels above any kind of writing is that level of description. You can create the entire world. Writing a novel versus writing a screenplay is the difference between making a house and a neighborhood and everything and just drawing up blueprints for someone else to make. As I'm working on the blueprints for the story of Beautiful Ruins, I'm trying to protect the characters and the themes and all of those things while realizing that I'm going to have to cut much of what I love. And it's hard because, honestly, if those sentences didn't belong in there, I wouldn't have put them in. So it's difficult, but I hope it will be a movie, and I hope we'll do it justice. I don't want to be the guy who ruined my own book. That would be terrible. Beth asks, are you working on another novel? If so, what is it about? I started by saying Beautiful Ruins took me 15 years. And I don't say that just to dissuade people from writing. It was 15 great years in a lot of ways. I published 5 other novels during that time, wrote the short stories that became the collection We Live in Water, worked on a bunch of other different things. But I also, during that time, was working on 2 or 3 other novels that for some reason didn't work, and I set them down. So when I finish a novel, the first thing I do is go back to the things that I was working on that ran into walls for whatever reason, that fell apart. And that's how I would always find myself back on Beautiful Ruins. I would go back to the beginning, start from scratch, rewrite every sentence, rethink the characters. And I found that time away from a book is actually the most rewarding thing. It allows you to see more clearly what's working and what isn't. You've experienced new things. You come to it as a different, more mature, and hopefully better writer. So I'm coming to a couple of books that I set down. One, as I said, I grew up in a family of cattle ranchers, but my dad could never make a living on the cattle ranch, so we had to move to the city for him to get a job at an aluminum factory. And when we did, he became afraid that his boys, especially, were going to be too soft from living in the city, so he decided we should bring some cattle with us. So I'm writing a novel about a suburban cattle ranching family, a comic novel, and I've been working on it even longer than Beautiful Ruins. If you go to the very moment when I first started writing about it, it's been about 17 or 18 years. So I'm back in that. I'm also working on a novel. I tend to be driven by thematics, probably more than a lot of writers. The themes of Beautiful Ruins, of dreams and of regret and of lost opportunities and also of Hollywood, the larger satirical elements. Those things always push me toward a novel. And I'm really interested now in ideas of class, especially given the widening income gap in our nation, the idea that we're also defunding education. We're taking away the ladder that allowed someone like me, frankly, a blue-collar kid who didn't come from a background where higher education was something that was assumed to rise up. Education is the ladder that allows people to move from one class to another, to aspire to make great things. And so I'm working on a novel about a genius kid who's very poor, and I'm not too far into it, but I really like it. I love the voice of it. He also has a babysitter that he's in love with, so might have an unlikely love story at the heart of it. But I never know what I'm going to finish, and my process is to not worry about that too much. So it could very well be something very different, the next novel. MK asks, Shane, Claire, and Michael have some insights into the screenplay business. Have you been involved in turning the financial lives of the poets into a movie? If so, did that happen before or after Shane and his friends were fleshed out in Beautiful Ruins? My first book, which was about the Ruby Ridge standoff, it's in paperback now called Ruby Ridge, was made into a miniseries for CBS, and so that was my first experience in Hollywood. I also worked a little bit, my novel Citizen Vince, I first envisioned as a movie. I wrote it as a screenplay, and in fact, I finished, and the thing about screenplays is they're about a minute per page. So most screenplays, you want them around 110, 120 pages. That'll be 2 hours of screen time. So being a novelist, I wrote Citizen Vince. Before I ever wrote as a novel, I wrote a script version, and I finished it and I looked at it, it was 184 pages, which would be a 3-hour movie, which couldn't be made. I knew that you had to shrink them, so rather than cutting it, I just shrunk the font and the leading and packed it on the page as tight as I could, and I sent it into a producer, a very big, well-known producer, and we had a meeting and he read it and he said, this is great, I really like it. Oh, thank you. He said, it's the most literate script I've ever read. And I said, wow, thank you. And he said, no, that's not a compliment. In Hollywood, I was droning on too long, describing things, doing things that screenwriters tend not to do. Since then, I've dabbled a little bit in screenwriting. Nothing has been made. Worked on Citizen Vince a little bit. Took it back as a novel, threw the script away, rewrote it as a novel, and it came alive in that way. That was always the form for that story. And then Financial Lives of the Poets, I was well into Beautiful Ruins. I'd already had a lot of pitch meetings, and so the pitch meetings and the sort of the life on the fringes of Hollywood is kind of what really drove those stories. And all I do is take notes. I take notes all the time. So I was constantly in pitch meetings taking notes and writing down what kind of water people were drinking. And I was called to meet with a producer one time in a house in the Hollywood Hills. And I told the film agent I was working with at the time that this producer wanted to meet with me. And he said, that guy hasn't made a movie in 15 years. And I went up to meet him, and he had a house in the Hollywood Hills very much like Michael Dean has. And I had a great time with him. First thing he told me was, I haven't made a movie in 15 years. And so we just walked around and talked. But there was a little bit of Michael Dean in that guy, and certainly his house. A little bit of Michael Dean in an agent I'd met years earlier who worked, was a famous agent at ICM. A little bit of Robert Evans certainly made his way into Michael Dean. So little bits here and there. Very little of my actual Hollywood experience, though. It was more the satire that I got, soaking up as anyone would, the culture, the crazy reality shows, for instance, which I thought the reality shows that I wrote about were insane until a producer actually called and asked if he could have them, and I said he was welcome to them. Kate asks, what are some of your favorite books and which authors have influenced you as a writer? Are there any recent books you have really enjoyed? This is always the hardest question for me because my fear of leaving someone out. But so I will do what I tell I teach sometimes, not as often as I used to, but I would always tell my students to make 2 lists of writers. One, to make a list of 10 writers that you love, and don't make this list thinking that your English professor is going to look over your shoulder. So if Coleridge isn't really on there, then don't put him on there. But make a list of authors that if you could take 10 books, those are the authors you'd grab. And then make another list of just 3 writers, and those 3 writers will be your trinity. If you were to start a religion around books, and you could only pick 3 to be the trinity, the 3 writers that would form a religion around books, who would you choose? And for me, then the answer becomes probably Kurt Vonnegut, who was my first hero as a writer, who melded humor with humanity, with a desire to write these stories that opened up and brought you in, but never lost their intelligence. I always felt like Kurt Vonnegut was accessible without ever condescending, without writing down. And that the humor came out of a very genuine place, and that his intersections with tragedy, I think, reflect what I always liked. later, he was my favorite writer as a young man, and later a million writers jumped ahead of him as far as the work. But I don't think I ever saw another figure who showed me what a writer should represent, like Kurt Vonnegut. The second one would probably be Joan Didion. I was a journalist for a while, and Joan Didion's sentences, the way they seemed carved out of granite, made me hear the music, I think, in writing. The White Album by Joan Didion, in which she writes, we look for the sermon in the suicide. I love the sound of that sentence, we look for the sermon in the suicide, but I also love what it says. I love the way she writes about storytelling itself. And Slouching Toward Bethlehem and the White Album were books that at the time stopped me cold in my tracks and made me rethink what it was to be a writer. The third one would probably be Don DeLillo. His ability, again, to use humor and the unlikely intersections of anxiety and cultural contemplation, I guess. The way he seems to be writing into not just characters, but into the whole culture, are terribly inspiring. And I think as a writer, I look at his series of mid-career novels, White Noise, Mao 2, Libra, Underworld, as a kind of DiMaggio streak, as good a books as any author in the 20th, early 21st century is able to put together in a row. Plenty of writers that I've read recently whose work I've loved. I really like Zadie Smith. I think she's an incredible writer. David Mitchell, I think, is wonderful. Jonathan Lethem, I've always loved his work. I'm excited for his new book to come out. There are so many that once I start down the road, all I can do is leave someone out, so I'll stop there. Well, thanks for having me. Read well, be bold, and we'll see you at the next book.